All right, welcome back to Psychedelics Today, everybody. Here with Joe Moore and Brett Greene. Brett, so I wanted to chat with you because you made a Facebook post, actually right after Joe and I were talking last week about just money investments, and you made just an interesting post on Facebook, and it kind of resonated, I think, what Joe and I were saying, and I was like, oh, hey, that we were just chatting about that. And ironically, I was just thinking about how this project got started. And I was like, I feel like, we're almost at 4 years here at Psychedelics Today. And so I went back into the archive and I saw that you were our first episode way back on May 11th, 2016. So we're coming full circle on a 4-year anniversary and welcoming you back on the show.
Wow, beautiful.
So yeah, let's kick this off. And since, you haven't been on here in a while, how about you just give folks a little bit of a background on who you are?
Well, great. I'm so honored to come full circle here. I guess because of what you just said, I mean, maybe I'll tell my story intertwined with our story, which was that, we met at Horizons way back then, and we were both relatively new to things, although I had been coming from Psychedemia, which was a conference at UPenn. I want to say it was back in 2012, and I'd been very involved with the movement in terms of maps and whatnot, going way back to when I was in high school. But really, that Horizons that you and I met, Kyle, was the first time that I started to get involved in a business way. And back then I was still working for the Center for Drug Discovery, where I've been for a little over 13 and a half years at Northeastern University, coming from a world-class cannabinoid lab that also had a serotonin lab above it. So I was very immersed in the science of both cannabinoids and, serotonergic compounds, aka psychedelics, those compounds that are involved in serotonergic pharmacology. And meeting you at Horizons, you were one of the first people that I met and, hit it off with. And Dennis McKenna was there that year, and in a manic frenzy that may have been low dose induced. I'm not particularly sure if it was. I would say it probably was. But we quickly determined that Brian Viveros, who I had met there as well, and Nathaniel Putnam, both of whom were students at Amherst, UMass Amherst at the time, that we were going to bring Dennis McKenna to UMass Amherst for a book signing. And at that time, I had no intention of, being much involved in the psychedelic world. I just figured, I like Dennis, and let's try to see if we can get a book signing going. And that quickly turned into the creation of Symposia, which then brought Dennis McKenna to Amherst. By that time, the book signing idea had evolved into a full-blown 2-day conference, which is called Symposium. And off we went to the races. And, at that Horizons conference, Kyle, you and I also discussed your work with breathwork and, your interest in the movement as well, and, what you could contribute. And it feels like that was really kind of a zeitgeist, and also where the seeds of Symposia and possibly Psychedelics Today and other groups were planted. So, I guess by way of that little story, I guess you could call me an entrepreneur and a kind of an armchair scientist, which is the charitable name that I give myself for basically learning just enough so that I can tell scientists what to do and collaborate with them. And I find myself now, I still work at the Center for Drug Discovery. I consult for Advanced Nutrients, which is one of the main companies. They've been around for 21 years in cannabis and now in hemp, providing nutrients all over the world. And I'm a investment banking advisor, managing partner, and managing member in 2 companies as of last year. So helping biotech mainly look for funding and raising capital. I also started a cannabis company in Massachusetts called Evocana is vertically integrated in the recreational cannabis market, minority owned business. And I've sort of went from being their CEO to their chief visionary officer because I kind of like to start things, build the teams, and move on. But basically, me in a nutshell, I've got a foot in cannabis, I've got a foot in psychedelics, and I've got my third foot in raising capital and interacting with the investment community around biotech initiatives predominantly, but also other things in the age of COVID, including PPE supplies, etc. So I consider myself an entrepreneur, a consultant, an advisor, and a longtime research administrator for the Center for Drug Discovery. And then if I'm being real charitable to myself, I call myself an armchair scientist.
Awesome. Thank you for that background. Yeah, every time I talk to you, I'm always amazed by like all the different things you have going on. I'm like, what is Brett up to now? You always have your hands in lots of different things, which is cool. I'm sure you're never bored.
Well, if you're anything like my longtime love, then your eyes roll in the back of your head as I describe my background.
Can you tell us a little bit about your company? Whatever you're comfortable with sharing.
Yeah, sure. So this is a brand new company. It's called Adelia Therapeutics. And I've been working with medicinal chemist by the name of Dr. Alex Nivoroshkin for quite a while now. And he and I had been working in the cannabinoid formulation side of things. We were doing some work for advanced nutrients together. We still are, as well as some formulation work for other companies, looking for novel cannabinoid formulas, delivery mechanisms, new product ideas, prototype generation, etc. And all the while, in my first conversation with Dr. Nivoroshkin, I had recalled that he was one of the inventors of deuterated S-ketamine, which was picked up by J&J, and his company, Amorsa Therapeutics, had worked out, an arrangement with J&J, and he and his partner, Dr. Mike Palfreyman, had been behind the success of this deuterated ketamine. And we woke up one day to realize that, hey, there's actually interest here. And I know the space very well, obviously. And these guys had a good success story with respect to the market, at least. And hey, we think that there might be a there. So we formed the company more or less within a week. We generated a deck, and I recruited Clint Canal, who's our pharmacologist and well-published pharmacologist in the psychedelic space, as well as Mike Palfreyman, who is a long-standing emeritus member of the drug discovery world, who he's had a lot of success in biotech. Dr. Nivoroshkin, who I described before, and an investment banking partner, Nova Capital. And we formed the company with the idea of essentially making drugs out of tryptamines where we can get more predictable dosing and have a better safety profile. And one of the things that I think set me off to do this was just seeing all of the other companies out there that I felt like either didn't really know what they were doing or were kind of operating for the wrong reasons. And so I set about creating this company with the idea that I was coming out of the psychedelic movement. These guys were coming out of traditional classical biopharma, but also had success in psychedelics. And that we could create a drug company that was infused with the same knowledge and, let's say the DNA of the psychedelic movement, so to speak, that they didn't have to be independent, and that was a different thing.
Yeah, it's really impressive. And it's a great time you entered, right? Like there's so many crazy things happening in the business space right now. And I'm glad to have somebody that's an insider doing this stuff as opposed to these, what do we want to call it? Johnny come latelys?
Yeah.
and, with no experience really. And some of these CEOs saying they haven't even had experience. And it's, very interesting. But I'm glad you are doing that and you're in that position you're in.
Thank you. Yeah. I think that a lot of people are coming out of cannabis and they think that, oh, this is just like that was. And it's just not, right? Like there's so many differences with cannabis and psychedelics that, it's hard to even know where to start with it. But I think that one of the things that CEOs are going to realize quickly is that the barrier to entry with this kind of thing is very high. And it's not enough to just want to take something through the FDA. I mean, you need to know what you're doing. And ideally, you want to have a team that's done it before with some drugs. I just happen to, win the lottery because my team has not only done this before countless times through the FDA, but they've also done it with the psychedelics, which there's no group that I know of that can say the same thing. So I think that's, again, a big differentiator. I would also say that, it doesn't matter if the CEO of a company is really experienced with respect to the drug development process. I think that to be coming into this field with all of its approaching infinity considerations about the psychological, spiritual, sociocultural, all of the considerations that we are brought through, not only as members of a psychedelic movement, but which the movement itself has these considerations because of the psychedelic experience. And you look at a lot of the CEOs that, have not taken the medicine, that also kind of begs the question as to how important is that? How important is it that one should experience the psychedelic experience and all of the intangible, ineffable qualities, which it's hard enough to put those ineffable qualities, obviously, into an attempt at language. I mean, ineffable meaning it's impossible, but the attempt at infusing this work with some of the, let's say, values that many, not all, who take psychedelics are imbued with from that experience, I think is one of the most important qualities to see in a company. And one of the reasons that I got into this space right now, as I did, because I didn't have to do this, I have a lot of options, is because I felt like there's both a need for the medicines that we're developing, and there's also a need for a leader in the space that is infused with those values and that has been here for a long time and isn't a Johnny come lately.
Yeah, that's awesome. Makes me wonder, I just had a thought pop in my head, like Kevin O'Leary, I wonder if he'll have any experiences now that he's an investor in MindMed and stuff like that. Or has he had any experiences?
Well, I think that to his credit, he's supported and kicked off this industry. And I don't see him out there making, huge statements about, for example, not supporting decriminalization or saying anything egregious. Now, I'm also not, on his Twitter page, scoping him out for when he's going to make a mistake. But, to the extent that mainstreaming is a good thing and that resources into this field is a good thing, I think he should be commended. As far as MindMed goes, I think that, again, there's a lot to respect about MindMed, pioneering in the field. I would have liked for that Forbes article that featured JR, Ron, who's the CEO, to have maybe been a little more balanced. My conversations with MindMed and with one of its senior consultants suggest that a lot of that was kind of taken out of context. And I think that they've been sort of unfairly targeted, but in full disclosure, we are in talks with MindMed about potential collaboration. But because I am in talks with them, I'm privy to their thinking processes. And I have to say that I feel like there's way too much vilification of people and institutions going on, and not enough of a willingness to work with people. So I don't want to just, be one of these guys that calls out people for being wrong. I want to acknowledge that all of us are divine beings capable of change and understanding. And I would rather be playing the role of trying to inspire new thoughts and deeper understandings than simply vilifying people and calling them out in terms of some of the uglier aspects of both cancel culture and psychedelic culture that I've been personally repelled by.
So there's a couple things. Like I don't think anybody in particular is an enemy unless they come straight out and say, we're going to work against your aims, your goals. JR, I think, has said something along the lines of, I'm not interested in talking or being involved with any of the decriminalization people. Kevin O'Leary on a conference recently said something along the lines of, this is not the 60s. Like, this is going to be very different. This has nothing to do with recreational or exploratory use. So, two kind of hints that this is, what they're going after. But I think we have to take the context into account. Like, they're trying to raise funds for their pharma company. And even like this press release around this quote unquote LSD abort drug that they put out was a little shallow because it didn't necessarily hint at a new class of drug. It didn't even hint that there were existing drugs that somewhat do that. It wasn't until Kyle was interacting with JR on LinkedIn that we heard that it might be a third or fourth class of drug that wasn't really in the mix before, like benzos and thorazine or whatever. Do you remember what he said?
I mean, when I commented on that, I said, well, what is this going to be about? Like, we already have medications like benzos or like antipsychotics that could potentially, curb those quote unquote side effects. And, he said, we want to create something that has a higher safety profile. And I mean, when you think about it, yeah, benzos are pretty dangerous, right? Alcohol and benzos are like one of the only drugs that you can die from withdrawal. Granted that if you're doing it in that context, PRN, you're only doing that maybe once. You're not prescribing that to folks, but
right, it's not
not going to be take home. And a lot of those antipsychotic drugs have really, I don't know, more negative side effects at times if you're taking it all the time.
I'll gladly take a benzo. I'm not going to gladly take an antipsychotic. But having a third option is going to be really valuable, I think. But at the same time, it's like, why aren't we just using psilocybin then, which is shorter, or IV DMT or something? Go ahead, Brett.
Well, I was just going to say that there's also ketanserin and pimavanserin, which are antagonists of the 2A receptor. Actually, one of them is an inverse agonist. So you actually have competing antagonists for the 2A receptor that are also known to work and block the effects of a trip. I would think that whatever drug that they have, and I haven't looked into it to a large extent, but I would think that it's a similar antagonist for that receptor, which, by the way, those drugs have been here for a long, long time. And to my knowledge, they have been used in ER situations for reversing trips, etc. I'm not sure about the novelty of what they have. I think what they have is a use patent. And if you know anything about patents, use patents are not the most secure patents because, you have to change 12 to 15% of a patent to basically get a new patent. And you can be, I don't know how deep on the rabbit hole we want to go, but you can create new uses for things. So I think from, to your point, Kyle, the PR, if you don't know anything about the space, you might read that and you might think, oh, it's very impressive. But I think that knowing a little more and being more sophisticated, a PR release like that isn't necessarily the most impressive thing. However, I do want to go back to something that you said, Kyle, which is that, or Joe, it's hard for me to hear who's who. Sorry about that, guys.
No worries.
But, you were mentioning things that Kevin O'Leary and JR have said. I want to say one thing that I do have a problem with is I'm fine if a pharma company doesn't want to be political. That's fine, right? They can stay out of politics. They can keep their head down and basically offer no comment about that. But I think that the tradition of, as I call it, beating down the ghost of Timothy Leary is so tedious for us, because we've been hearing that for some of us for, since Leary was alive. And it's not, somehow this new thing of, oh, hey, it's time to, differentiate ourselves from the 60s. That's such a tired thing that we've been doing for decades, which is why we're here anyway. That when I hear it, and when I hear people say, oh, well, this is the 60s, and it makes my eyes roll, because, frankly, it suggests a complete whitewashing of the history of psychedelics, of the role of clandestine agencies, and some of the more nefarious events around psychedelics, and arguably some of the more nefarious purposes for the proliferation of psychedelics in the 60s. And it also whitewashes a lot of the good that people back then did, which is why we're here. So there's, for me, like a lack of gratitude, a sense of, people coming in, not really knowing the movement, the history, and literally colonializing that with kind of this whitewashing tactic. And that's really what gets my goat. If organizations have no interest in decriminalization, then just don't talk about it. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what you were kind of suggesting on that Facebook post, right? Like really respecting the lineage, the history, and also not wanting to, colonize the space. I mean, why aren't we respecting the history a little bit more? Why do we have to say, we're not trying to do what happened in the 60s? It's like, well, there's a lot of stuff that came out of that, right? Like, is it necessarily negative? I don't think so, right? I mean, probably wouldn't be doing what we're doing, right? I mean, and when you say that, Brett, it almost makes me think it's like we're just trying to extract only the good that came out of it. Oh, here's these classes of compounds that, are mind expansive and might have therapeutic potential, but we're just going to dismiss everything else that happened because it has a bad name, right? And that doesn't feel good, right? Because it's like we're on the backs of giants in a sense, right? That saying of, anybody that came before us really has paved the ground for us to be here, and we should respect that.
Well, and I think it belies an attempt, conscious or not, for psychedelics to be tamed, like a taming of these molecules. Which, Terence McKenna, I forget the exact quote, but it's something about how institutions can never fully use psychedelics because psychedelics destroy institutions. So there's like a fundamental misunderstanding or whitewashing or attempt at suppressing that element of psychedelics, which isn't true for everybody, but is true for a lot of people. Now, the flip side of that is that a lot of the progressiveness that has been attributed to psychedelics has also been attributed to counter-revolutionary measures that some of these agencies may have been involved in through the proliferation of psychedelics. So I think that there's both like poles, right? There's sort of this fear that this is Brave New World being enacted in front of our eyes, right? But then there's also the sense by the same people that are, essentially trying to enact that, although in their minds, I'm sure it's not as nefarious as maybe other people would look at it. But the flip side of that is that those same people may be looking at this and saying, well, we also have to acknowledge that there's a disrupting quality to this, which we can't control, and that we can only sort of pretend like we can. And the medical model is a great way of presenting the illusion of control. And it's always been a great way to present that illusion, but it's an illusion. And these things are going into places and doing things that we still don't fully understand. And frankly, I think that the medical model has no interest in understanding maybe some of the more significant implications of these medications. And I mean, we can get way out there if you want, but I think that, let's just say that if everything that we can discover through psychedelic research is like floors in a building, I would say that there's an infinite floors, and we're on like level 3. And I think that most organizations aren't interested in getting to that infinite level. They're interested in maybe having the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience that's really weird remain anomalous, remain outlier data points, as opposed to actually look at what's going on. But those of us who have been committed to this movement and have been familiarized with these medications are convinced otherwise, that what may be the most interesting thing about these drugs is what they tell us about consensus reality.
Totally. Yeah. Joe and I have been talking about this pretty often, just about the weirdness, right? And I feel like in the medical model, psychological world, it's like, how do we just reduce this, that these things help us process trauma? We're just putting it in terms of psychological frameworks. But like, what happens when the weird or the spiritual, the mystical kind of get involved here? And how can we talk about that? And, kind of coming from the therapy model, I feel like sometimes they don't talk about it. It's just like, oh, here, we're going to work on trauma or this or that, which is, fine and interesting. But, how then are clinicians and therapists working in this space going to then start to take in the account of, I guess I'll put quote unquote, the weird, right? I guess from Eric Davis. But I don't know, Joe, do you have any thoughts on that really quick?
Right. Well, it's kind of the paradigm we're living in right now. It's, we've got Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and others telling us what reality is, right? When we have no clue. Science is so young. We have a little bit of an idea, and we're getting better at it every day. But, this progress is slow. Like, not that long ago, the Earth was the center of the galaxy or, existence. So, and just look at all this shit injecting bleach and whatnot. Like, this is where our current popular mindset is, and we're far off from being culturally, philosophically sophisticated enough to, as Brett says, infinite floors. Like we're not ready for that, but we can set the stage and help each other get ready. But it's not going to neatly fit into a medical model.
Well,
and I think you're totally right. Like the medical model is interesting, but it's only interesting a little bit relative to what else can be happening.
I was just going to say, this is why I and many people that I know and respect promote the idea that there's going to be multiple modalities, because
yes.
Each modality offers something unique, and it is in itself it has its own DNA. And I give this example all the time. Tripping in a clinic in Johns Hopkins with all of the trappings of that protocol gives that outcome, and which is to say nothing negative about that outcome. I mean, I think it's extremely important that outcome exists and that modality exists. And I would never try to suggest otherwise. But the modality of taking these things in a forest and communing with nature is another modality that I would hate to see undermined by anybody, especially by people that supposedly get what these things are all about. Modalities allow for these unlockings of different experience levels. And I think each one is interesting. And the decrim movement and the shamanic modality, the resort style modality, all of these things offer its own outcome. And they're all interesting. And if we know that set and setting play this important role in the outcome of an experience, then you'd think that we would want to be researching different modalities to attempt to derive different outcomes. So I think that the nice thing about the medical model is that there's a framework that has been established by the FDA for how to legitimize, or maybe not legitimize, but ensure that there's some standardization associated with this process. We're not going to be able to create a standard experience for everybody. And in fact, one of the reasons that Delia exists is because there are people that I believe could use these experiences who may not want a mystical experience, or they may not want an experience that's going to really, threaten their peace of mind. But yet they want the benefits. And is there a possibility that we can tailor through drug discovery an experience like that for them? Because we know from clinical studies that there's a small percentage of the people that are going through these things that are adversely affected. Now, do those people deserve our attention? I mean, I think a lot of people in the psychedelic community, I'm afraid to say, are sort of like, I don't know about sadism, but they think no pain, no gain. And that, anybody that isn't interested in jumping off a cliff in their mind is somehow lesser than. And I don't think that that's right. On the one hand, the psychedelic movement doesn't own psychedelics. They don't own molecules. They don't own pharmacology. They don't own what we decide to do to help other people. They don't own anything, frankly. But what they do have is they do have their history, and they do have the fact that they have known for a long time that there was something here, and they fought for a long time for recognition of the therapeutic benefits. And so, I think that oftentimes people think that, just because they've been here for a while, it means that they have a right to dictate what a good modality is and what a good set and setting is and what good motivations are. And I think that that's stretching it. But I think that what we can and what we should own as a movement, which is a movement of many disparate strains and tribes and whatnot, is a desire for authenticity. Because ultimately, I think the thing that's universal to me about psychedelics is they're pushing towards greater authenticity. And a company or a person or money or any kind of interest that is inauthentic is a very loud, in this space, is a very loud walking contradiction that hurts. And I think it hurts us fundamentally because we see that inauthenticness and we think to ourselves, hey, we're failing here. We're failing because the experience of authenticity that we've received from this is completely lost on these purveyors and so-called overnight experts in this space. And that's what I think a lot of us are viscerally reacting to. But at the same time, I really strongly disagree with the normative approach of trying to tell patients, biopharmaceutical developers, and others, what the only way to trip is. Oh, you're not tripping with music? Oh, you're doing it completely wrong. Oh, you're not lying down with a blindfold? You're doing it wrong. I mean, I think we should get away from the right and wrongness of the mechanics, and we should get into the right and wrongness of the ethics, which that I think is a much greater conversation that we need to have.
Yeah, like I'm pretty public about being interested in having part of this movement, trying to understand all these other contexts and trying to make them okay. Like, is it okay to go to a fish or a base nectar show on LSD? Like, should that be super illegal? Should we be spending, like, this is all, we have so many issues wrapped into one here, right? We're living with decades of very expensive propaganda. And so history is more our enemy than anything else. But like, how do we get all of these things? How do we shift culture and not allow money to interest to just totally take it, Say, no, you guys are still losers, same way you were in the 60s. You're just assholes with money for drugs. It's like, no, it's different than that.
I think it's, just being able to be a little bit open. I mean, like me coming from more of a psychology background and really kind of focusing on the therapy aspect. I mean, working on this project together and hearing so many different use cases and just hearing different stories of how people have used it. Sometimes it's definitely pushed me a little bit of expanding, and that's been hard and challenging at times, of me kind of coming more from this therapeutic background and being like, oh, this is, I think, my biased approach on how you can really maximize benefits and minimize risks, and, coming from that. And then also hearing other people's experiences and being like, wow, there's actually other ways to go about doing this, and just, trying to be open with myself about that and be like, hey, the therapeutic way is one way. And I think that is really great for the people that are really struggling, that need that really safe container, that need that level of care. And I think, we have to look at this as an individual case of who needs that individual care. And the medical model is going to be a wonderful, wonderful thing for people that need that. Right. And there's other people that they're going to explore it other ways and get some benefit out of it. So I don't know. Yeah. I mean, doing this project has definitely got me to try to be a little bit more flexible and understand all these different ways of being, and respecting it.
At the same time, Kyle, you mentioned the therapeutic model, there's a medical model, but for a while that there's so many strains of therapy models. So, I mean, you've got cultural therapy. You've got, I don't have to go through all of them, but, I think each one offers kind of a different glimpse into, again, the possibilities around treatment outcomes. And we can weigh those different therapeutic models for, I think, different benefits. And, as psychedelic therapy becomes even more commonplace, we might see adoption of psychedelics into these different therapeutic models with some kind of attempt at developing maybe a hierarchy or whatever, but where we can start to weigh the benefits of each of those. So, there's a much greater spectrum of different models where that could be relevant, and which are yet to be explored. And we have, a quote unquote medical model that is probably a syncretic version of good things from each of those thrown into a hodgepodge. But I think it's important that we don't look at necessarily the hodgepodge that's evolved as, the end, right? It's just the beginning, and more development into different models and into different technologies and into different, means of integration. All of this is a good thing, and I mean, I guess that this goes naturally into what may be the next iteration of this discussion, which is the patents, and where patents come in and how ethical patents are, what they mean. Because as we do more discovery and as new innovations come in, patents are the language of invention for the capitalist system. It's just the way that it is. There's good patents. I should say that there's good ways of patenting things, and there's bad ways of patenting things. And I think how we determine what's good or bad really has to do with fairness, and with a sense of compassion, because there certainly are patent trolls out there that are trying to attack others for personal gain. And this has been a tradition of a lot of, moneyed people and investors. And some of those investors, I think, are pretty big in this space. So, but, patents as a topic can be really a straw man if we go after patents and we don't go after behavior. So in my opinion, we're not going to get rid of patents. We are not going to decrease the complexities around issues with patents. But when we're talking about ethics, on the one hand, it's naive to think that, somebody should go to market without an IP position, knowing that another company could come in, get an IP position, and then be far ahead. But at the same time, a charter of ethics for this space really ought to include, do these companies have an obligation to not go after other companies when they can avoid it, or mediate any kind of disagreements, as opposed to get into these huge lawsuits? Is there an obligation because we are part of a psychedelic movement, or do we just give up the idea that there should be some overarching ethics involved and just start realizing that this is simply just another manifestation of capitalism?
Like, the issue to me will come up if and when they choose to bully small organizations. Say, no, you can't use mushrooms like that, or no, you can't use LSD like that because of our patents, and we're going to shut you down. Like, we see it in all sorts of industries, right? Like, even in the bicycle or outdoor space, we see that stuff constantly. And what is it going to happen? Probably, but how do we move forward? Do we try to befriend them? Like, do we try to help them and have them understand our point of view? Like, I just don't necessarily see a nice, clean way forward.
Well, this is what I would say the role of what a North Star should be. Not to call them out by name or whatever, but whoever is proposing a charter of ethics, one of the 10 commandments of that charter shouldn't be, hey, remember to breathe. Like, yeah, fuck you. I know how to breathe. But what are we going to do about patent trolls? And so there's a need for us to uncover these ethics and come to some kind of consensus, I feel, or at least hold companies that are coming into this accountable. But unfortunately, the loudest voices in the room around ethics right now are companies that seem to be A, conflicted in terms of their special interests, and B, using the platform that they're creating as a bit of a smokescreen, because in the background, they're doing all kinds of questionable things that a real ethical charter might have an issue with.
You have an example that you're able to chat about, or?
Well, I don't know if I need to get specific, but what I would say is that I think a ethical charter that covers cognitive liberty, that covers business ethics, including patent law, and that covers responsibility and accountability for patient safety. Not just to say, hey, we agreed that we're going to be safe, because we all know that that's meaningless, but that actually gets into the nitty gritty about how things like malpractice, things like who's accountable for, if somebody has an adverse event, things like what are we going to do to hold therapists accountable for what they do, whether it's, cases of abuse, which we've seen in the last years, or whether it's patient neglect, and how do we deal with that? Maybe we don't need a Gestapo that is going to be, policing everybody, but at the same time, I think that we need to have some guiding principles on how to deal with these things as they arise as a movement, or else I think that, we need to just admit defeat, that actually this isn't a movement at all. If anything, it's some disparate, I call them tribes of, people. And, what constitutes a tribe? I mean, to me, a tribe is a group that experiences psychedelics in a certain way, and Charles Manson probably represented his own tribe, right? And, maybe we represent a tribe where we experience oneness and peace, and we discover who our most divine selves are on psychedelics. That's my experience with psychedelics. And not everybody experiences that. So either I think we own this hodgepodge of a movement with all of its disparate characters and tribes and whatnot, and we try to develop some consensus that isn't just platitudes and bullshit, or we just say, you know what, this whole idea of a community, of a movement and whatnot, it was bullshit from the beginning, and it's, you know, this experiment with, you know, big money into the space is just proving that, and we should just basically abandon that and let go of it and move on. Because I don't see there being like kind of a middle ground there. Like if we're going to be sticking around and making sure that we are doing everything that we can to minimize harm and maximize benefit as it concerns the use of these medicines, then there needs to be at least some attempt at a consensus from all of the major stakeholders. And I think that attempt, again, should be pretty specific about, you know, not about remember to breathe, but about, hey, like, this is what we're going to do to minimize harm and maximize benefit. And we're really going to take patient safety seriously. We're really going to wrestle with these things.
Yeah. Something that's, I guess, coming up for me, and I think just from some of the folks that have reached out to us in the past about like ethics and especially around abuse, where it makes me think like legitimizing the field and having these, you know, maybe legal entities there, you know, maybe boards being able to take action is like right now, it's like, how do you hold people accountable for some of this stuff where, say, somebody went to an underground facilitator, abuse happened, and then they can't speak out to the police or can't really report it anywhere because then they're kind of admitting that they took an illegal substance. And so it's this weird catch-22 where it's like, how can you create an ethics board when some of this stuff is illegal and it's this really dicey area? I don't know. It's really interesting. Versus like somebody raised this point where it was like, oh, ketamine. You know, you have licensed therapists. People are doing this above ground. If something happened, I can report them to a licensing board and say, hey, this happened. Versus now how things are operating just kind of in the background. Or on the flip side, you know, it's like, oh, well, you know, you don't want to report that because then it's going to hurt the movement and hurt the field and all this research. And so it's this weird dilemma that I feel like we're in right now with ethics.
Well, and you know, Kyle, ethics has always been, you know, whether you look at the Talmud or you look at, you know, Socratic reasoning, a series of questions. It's not the Ten Commandments, really. In fact, even in the tradition of the Ten Commandments, there's this myth about how, you know, Moses brought down the Ten Commandments because he had, you know, a much bigger book that went into the Kabbalah and all the esoteric stuff. But basically, the Israelites pissed off God with the golden calf, so they got the effable version rather than the ineffable version. And we could speculate what the ineffable version was. Maybe it was ayahuasca. But I think that we're used to, as a Judeo-Christian society, pretty simplified understanding of what ethics is. And it, you know, unfortunately, it's not a top 10 blog, you know, and, you know, that obviously top 10 blogs are very important nowadays, but that might not be where we get our ethics from. You know, ethics is messy, and that's why we have ethicists, not to simplify the process, but to at least have a process so that we can ask the tough questions and derive maybe not perfect answers, but at least like answers that have incremental value and relative value compared to, you know, functional value compared to what we have now. And so I think that we need less maybe open statements about this or that people can sign on to, which, by the way, doesn't really keep them from breaking those open statements, but that might be another conversation. But that at least allows us to, you know, ask the right questions, wrestle with the messy details. All of this is extremely messy. You know, there's nothing simple about it. But I mean, hey, that's the tradition of ethics. do we expect that ethics is going to change to make us feel more comfortable? I mean, probably not.
Yeah, exactly. This is like, we would love it to be so cut and dry that we can just snag marks and then slap it on this thing. It's not that simple.
Yeah.
Like, there's so much here.
Or Jordan Peterson, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Ugh. Tried to read one of his books once and almost gagged after like 20 pages. So had to wrap it up. Yeah. So really interesting. So like, I'm working with a few people right now on kind of a side project on ethics and kind of like, I'll come out and say it's some sort of industry association. We don't really necessarily want to use that term, but it's like, what is the minimum acceptable requirements here if you're doing this kind of work? Because there has to be some sort of minimum, and how to not encroach on native peoples that have this stuff. Like, I'm dealing with Westerners, hopefully exclusively in this conversation, because I don't want to overstep my bounds. I know there was a movement a few years back that was trying to do something similar with the ayahuasca space, and they got kind of squashed because it was a little prescriptive to indigenous folks, which I don't want to do.
Yeah, and you probably know I was pretty involved in that whole story, and I think that the people involved in that weren't treated fairly. But
which seems to be a common theme here in the psychedelic space. Like, are we just crybabies, or can we be adults and like have these conversations and not just panic on Facebook and talk shit on social constantly? Like, let's have a fucking conversation, guys. It's okay.
Well, I think all you have to do is bring an ethicist into the room, and suddenly, all you have is nuance. So, I would recommend that any attempts at ethical boards or whatever have somebody who's a trained ethicist. I mean, fuck, they need jobs too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And who better to keep us in line or help keep us in line?
Yeah, I'm always shocked by like how like the idea of ethics is just so misunderstood. And I have to wonder, is this misunderstood because people are ignorant, or is it because they're not ignorant, and by misunderstanding it publicly, they can, get to evade the questions that we really ought to be asking.
Yeah, it's fantastic. There's so many with this whole subject, because it's so young and has been illegal for so long to really do human research in. Like, we're stunted, we're developmentally delayed in a lot of ways, and like, I think that could be one of the main reasons here. We're not all speaking the same language. We don't have similar backgrounds. Some of us have worked in corporations. Some of us have, went right from university to being full-time psychedelic advocates. And that's, that's great, but it comes with baggage. All of it comes with a certain set of baggage, and it really, potentially builds up walls,
Well, you bring up a good segue maybe, which is, what should we expect from companies that are coming into the space? Dennis, I was on a conference not too long ago, watching it, and Dennis McKenna was saying, what are companies that are making money in the space going to do in terms of putting it back into either, protecting indigenous lands or preserving indigenous culture or supporting people that are doing good work in the movement. The one corollary to cannabis that we might want to see is what we've seen with cannabis, which is that there's been national recognition about how the war on drugs has been predominantly deleterious in effect to people of color. And there have been, in my opinion, not entirely successful programs to try to remedy those effects. I think that we should be pushing for something similar with psychedelics, although unlike with cannabis, I think that we should be attempting to make it voluntary and using shame as a force as opposed to the government. And there's a few reasons I would prefer it to be voluntary, namely because I don't want the government to get all red tape happy, more red tape happy than they're already going to be. But I do think that we should be thinking about what we feel companies in this space might owe to this movement and to organizations that are doing good work and doing the work of really paving the way for these medicines to be here in the first place. Because I swear, I feel like a lot of people coming into this think, oh, this all got started because either Michael Pollan wrote a book or because, there was a study that was positive at Hopkins or, because there were several psilocybin studies and then all of a sudden, like everybody, realized, hey, there's something to be had here. But we know that's bullshit. I mean, we know that this was decades in the making of trying to promote common sense, looking at the evidence and looking at data. And I don't know about you guys, but I spent many years doing my own advocacy and having people think that I was totally crazy. People that now think, oh, actually, yeah, of course these are medicines. Like that understanding didn't happen overnight. We had to work on that with no pay. Some of us lost our families, lost our freedom. We paid. And, I don't think that it's unreasonable to ask that these corporations that are coming in, that are going to now profit from all of the advocacy that we've done, give back. And I'd like to see them give back into really a foundation type model so that foundation can fund organizations like yours, like Symposia, that, we're not asking, say Compass to fund Symposia. We're asking Compass to fund a foundation. And what that foundation does might actually expose some shit that Compass might not like, for example. But that's just the way that it is. And that, I think, is it solves several problems. One, I think it brings on organizations like ours as stakeholders in this movement in a real way where we can continue to influence policy and continue to hold groups accountable. Two, I think it allows these corporations to contribute to this other discourse that may not be their main focus, but which is nonetheless important, including the ethical discourse. And three, it allows for people that are committing their lives to this subject and have committed their lives to this to continue to do so and survive.
It makes me think, just as you're saying that, like some of the smaller people have been really laying this foundation, and then somebody just comes in, they're like, oh, here's the opportunity, and now I'm just going to take advantage of it and not really and just watch these like kind of small people crumble. And just in terms of like cannabis, I'm just even thinking about like all the people that really sacrificed their lives, got arrested, this and that, and probably are still in jail because of whatever they were doing. And then you see companies come in, rich white people predominantly, and they're making money off of it while some people are still in jail doing what, now is somewhat acceptable. And that feels kind of crappy, I think. Like people that have really risked their life in certain ways or their reputation to talk about some of this stuff. And then all of a sudden somebody else moves in and now it's like acceptable and okay while, there's a lot of sacrifice to be made. I mean, just you saying this, Brett, I'm thinking like, oh yeah, like I've been talking about this for a while and most people either thought I was crazy or like didn't want to hear it. And those same people are coming back be like, wow, like Michael Pollan's book, like I had no idea all this was happening. And, oh, wow, like you were right about some of this stuff. And I'm just sitting here like scratching my head going,
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I don't know, like what kind of vision, well, I guess you kind of touched on it about a foundation, but like any other like vision on like how like you would like to see some of this move forward out?
Well, first of all, I would like to see the same companies that are trying to distance themselves from the 60s acknowledge that it was people like us and like Timothy Leary and like countless others that made this happen, that allowed them to be where they're at. And that the least that they can do is not try to get ahead by bashing those people or by bashing a tradition through sweeping generalizations that they don't understand and they don't know, and they obviously don't care to understand the dimensions of. So I would like that kind of behavior to stop, because it's really an insult to so many legacies. I would also like these organizations to commit to preserving the idea that there can be other modalities. And again, to not try to get ahead financially or otherwise by outlawing, a shamanic modality in this country, or my ability to take mushrooms in a forest. That they either stay neutral on that, or they don't fight, either publicly or otherwise, the mission of cognitive liberty. Because I think that doing so, you're on the wrong side of history. And that's all there is to it. In terms of the foundation work, I think just that if we can come up with a true consensus, a true group that represents, all of the stakeholders in psychedelic bills, maybe we do it via blockchain voting. I don't know, but maybe we want to create a true institution that has buy-in from everybody. And that institution can serve as a foundation for all of these companies to donate into, and where the members of that institution vote on where that money should go. I don't have the bandwidth to do all of that, but that's kind of what I would like to see happen. An organization that can get funded through donations from these companies, and where it can fund other operations and organizations that exist that are charitable facing.
I like it. Sounds also very democratic, like really bringing in all these different parties and really trying to figure out like how to move forward. How do you?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, you can go if you had a thought.
Well, I was just going to say, if we're going to consider ourselves a movement, I think we need to really take a good look in the mirror, if that's actually what this is, and determine if there's anything universal about us that we can hang our hat on, that we can then have some kind of collective agency around.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah, I guess like thinking about the collective agency and just our common shared thing. I guess the question I was going to ask before was, how do you balance this kind of corporate world and then kind of like the outcast psychedelic world? Because I think there's a lot of, I don't know if I should say outcast, but, just kind of like the people that have been doing this for a bit. And like, how do you find this balance between all this? I think a lot of people are struggling with the new people coming in. And so how do you find balance for yourself and you starting up a company and, you have this background and then moving into more drug development? Like, yeah, how do you approach this? And what type of advice would you give for people that are kind of really grappling with all these mixed emotions of what's really going on right now?
I would say, let a chemist be a chemist. Let a pharmacologist be a pharmacologist. Let an ethicist be an ethicist. When we try to make a chemist an ethicist, we're going to be disappointed, right? And so my advice is that people should figure out what their core strengths are and recognize what other people's core strengths are and allow them to be who they are. We shouldn't expect that people are going to be who they're not. And one of the biggest problems that I think the cannabis industry has faced is in states like Massachusetts, where they've tried to regulate and implement legally a positive impact plan that is associated, for example, with one getting a license. So cannabis, they're expecting these companies to do the work of a nonprofit. And part of the issue with that is that you're taking away what nonprofits do and already do well in many cases, and you're making groups that aren't necessarily talented in that area and have a lot of shit that they have to do focus on that. So you're taking resources away from groups that are doing good work, and you're making groups that are trying to sell cannabis responsible for that good work. And you're also taking away, I think, the focus that one needs in order to do anything well, because you're dividing an organization's focus when they need that focus so desperately in order to survive in the business environment. So I'd like us to be able to learn how to avoid that. And one way to avoid that is to let companies be companies. We're not going to change capitalism overnight. We're not going to change the mandate of a drug company to do the best it can for its shareholders, whether we call it a benefit corporation or not. And we're not going to change a lawyer's mandate to protect their client and do whatever is best in their interest. But what we can do is we can continue to support the voices out there that are pushing these issues forward, that are holding people accountable, that are supporting the good actors and promoting those. And in the words of Buckminster Fuller, creating new realities that are better than the old ones, which I think is the best way to deal with what we don't like. So I think my biggest advice is just be who you are, let other people be who they are, and don't expect that they are going to be you or vice versa. The neurodiversity is a good thing. At the same time, once we come together and really start to figure out what is universally the case with all of us interested in this field, because I think that there are things that bring us together. What can we agree on that will protect people, that will protect companies, that will minimize harm and maximize benefit on an individual and a societal level? Where we can start to have that nuts and bolts discussion, I think we need to get over our squabbling a little bit and start to really organize.
Right. If we look at history, movements often were disrupted by factionalizing, like manufactured factions almost. And this has been happening. It's just a tool of empire. And this is clearly, in a lot of ways, what's happening. Like, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to communicate nicely and cleanly with the decriminalized nature folks. But I guess there's philosophical differences, and for whatever reason, that just gets in the way. So there's a lot of really interesting issues that are really marginal relative to our actual aims. If we can figure that out, we're in great shape, Brett. But, can we? Yeah, can we? I was very upset going into Horizons this year based on all the factionalization and kind of just crazy amplified stuff that was going on. And I was saying stuff like, there is no psychedelic movement. There is no psychedelic community, because what I saw was factions just going hard at each other and not really trying to build. It's a lot easier to tear something down than to build something. What was that, Kyle?
Yeah, not very cohesive, right? All these different narratives kind of arguing and saying like this, and not really. I mean, I guess there is some common thread of wanting to get these medicines out there, but yeah, there's all these different approaches. And I think, not being able to agree upon that really causes a lot of disconnection at times.
Well, there's this impression that if we disagree philosophically or politically or whatever, then that necessitates a moral incongruity where I'm right, not right factually, but right factually and morally, and you're wrong factually and morally. And so long as we have that core where we're distrusting of each other's motives so fundamentally that, you're a CIA plant and you have sinister motivations and I'm this righteous idealist, I do worry that we're not going to be able to have any kind of common ground. At the same time, I would say that there are bad actors. It happens.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so do we not pay attention to them? No, I think that we pay attention to them. And I think that we call out when necessary. But, I want to be sure that when we do that, we're offering a good alternative solution that has some logic behind it. Mm. Because I really believe in the Buckminster Fuller method of change, which is to, create new vessels in the carcasses of the old ones, as opposed to just sit there and yell at people. And I mean, that's one of the main philosophical differences that I had with Symposia, which, I founded, but which I have basically become an advisor of and finally resigned from officially. And, that to me was the biggest, I guess, difference was that I never intended to kind of be the tisk guy wagging his finger at people. I wanted to create new realities that were just self-evidently better than what we were leaving behind. And, I still commend Symposia for the good work that they do and for calling out people when they deserve it, because I think that we need a group that's doing that.
Totally. But
it has to be balanced. We have to balance the critiques with instruction, destruction and construction, right? They have the same what is that, suffixes? So same suffixes. So I think that we need to have them shoulder to shoulder in our process of criticism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's important to have critiques. Like if we're going to have some sort of coherent thing happening, we have to be highlighting the good and the bad and the middle ground, like what's neutral here. And just the actuality. Like it's great to critique from a place of idealism, perhaps what might exist in 100 years, but we have to deal with, 2020 politics and the 2020 financial landscape, which is really weird and really difficult. Like when we're dealing with extinction, this whole Extinction Rebellion thing, like how do we even relate to anything anymore?
Yeah. Well, and I'm doing better now financially than I've ever done. And it's like so funny because like I can't travel. I can order like nice groceries, but fuck knows if they actually get to me on like when I'm trying to cook dinner. It's like money itself is starting to lose its meaning, which is arguably the real unraveling of our society right in front of our eyes. And you're right. Like in this context where it's arguable that psychedelics are contraindicated for risk to this virus, for example, that any of this has the same kind of meaning that it even had 6 months ago.
Yeah, it's true. I keep thinking like, what is the world going to look like tomorrow? I have no idea, right? And as like all these new things develop, I just sit and wonder. I'm like, we don't know what it's going to look like next week, right? I mean, things are just changing so rapidly, and maybe the things that we're so like hooked on right now may change dramatically in the next few months. I mean, it's really all uncertain at the moment at times. So yeah, I'm curious just to see how all this unfolds in the next few months to few years.
Yeah.
I'm kind of hoping the financial situation is so dire that they kind of just scrap the drug scheduling system and the DEA and fund some sort of cultural program to integrate it a little easier. Maybe a little more funding at the FDA to help speed drugs through this process. But who knows?
Well, it makes me wonder too about like, kind of critique on like psychedelic tourism and like high-end retreats. And it's like, I always think like, well, okay, travel, like what's going to happen to the travel industry and will that even be a thing, within the next year or so? And then also economically, like if things continue the way it goes and people like aren't having jobs and unemployment still goes, I mean, are these people that have this idea of these high ticket price tag or high ticket therapies, that's not even going to be accessible for most people. And so this idea of creating that, maybe a few months ago, a lot of people are like, oh, like, we could do all this. Now, kind of thinking like, who knows where that's going to be next year? I mean, what is travel going to look like? What are the airlines going to be doing if they're losing all this revenue and money? I mean, I don't know.
Well, Carl, you bring up a great point. And I mean, the high ticket price for treatment isn't just the retreat model. I mean, we're talking $18,000 projected per treatment for MDMA. And,
right. Yeah.
So, and that's in this country in the medical model. Insurance companies aren't going to be covering this right out of the gate. And hospitals are obviously places where if you have COVID outbreaks, A, you might not want to go there, and B, they might not have the resources to serve you there.
Yeah.
And then C, I mean, according to some early work, I guess that Nichols' father and son have suggested, these might be contraindicated for, risk for COVID. So I think that we're in a pretty uncertain period for this, but ironically, as soon as you have companies that start to raise a lot of money, the meat of their company takes a bit of a backseat to the speculative value of either the stock or, the projections into the future, which is both good and bad because it means that we can raise money on the speculative value without having to wait around until we're done with COVID.
Right.
But on the other hand, it begs the question of how much of this is speculation versus real value, which is, of course, always a question with companies that, especially companies going public, but companies that are in the biotech sphere. So, I think that we may very well ask whether the cost of this kind of therapy is sustainable. We know that the cost is prohibitive for most people. And, in terms of access, a lot of the concerns that Symposia and others have expressed about access are valid concerns. When you look at the numbers, who has 18 grand to go get this done? And then the people that are treatment resistant depressed, like how many of them have that kind of resource where they can get this treatment paid for, versus how many of them can go to a neighborhood dealer, get the mushrooms, take the mushrooms with a sitter, and have an amazing experience for $75 to $200 maybe.
Yeah.
So I think that the economics of this is one of the things that very few companies, I think, are really being honest about.
Right.
Because, not all of the psilocybin companies are going to make it. They might make it through clinical trials, but one of the reasons why maybe they're after decriminalization, some of them, is because they see the writing on the wall that some of the unregulated or less regulated use of these medicines are going to arguably cannibalize their market share, and they don't want to see that. And so because they don't want to see that, they are pitting themselves against greater access, etc. So one of the reasons that Adelia was started was to explore less costly therapies and therapeutic options that could exist, so that we could expand upon the base of the patient population that can have access, as well as to make this more attractive in the long run to insurance companies, who I think companies have a really Kool-Aid drinking tendency in this space, that is the biotech space, sometimes to assume that insurance companies are going to be on board when they might not necessarily be on board.
Right.
In fact, like a lot of companies have sank or swam on the insurance companies deciding that they're going to participate in a program or not. Right. So, another whole dimension to this is being very sober about the dollars and cents here, and not succumbing to a lot of the hype.
Right.
Of course, the second component to that is that the FDA isn't just going to approve every psychedelic because it's your favorite one, right? Like, they're going to look at the data and they're going to make a determination, and they might not approve that, right? Whatever it is, regardless of how popular it is or whatever we think, not all of them might make the cut.
Mm-hmm.
It's questionable whether psilocybin will make a cut. Maybe psilocybin has a black box warning from the FDA. I mean, there are actually reasons to think that, you know, that it could, regardless of the breakthrough status. So there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's an awful lot of noise and bullshit. And there's a lot of beating Timothy Leary's ghost that I think ought to be changed. We need these companies, despite their, you know, inclinations towards, you know, a corporate exterior, to be authentic. I think people are just craving authenticity.
Yeah.
And especially in a movement that takes drugs that force authenticity in a lot of people.
Or you'd hope so, right?
Well, I can't stand the irony, so I'm running for it, you know?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're essentially at time, Brett. I'm wondering if you want to maybe have any closing statements.
Closing statements. You know, I think we need to be as kind to each other as we need to be real to each other. We need to figure out how to balance that brutal honesty with kindness and compassion.
Yeah.
Even for our enemies, because being fake and being unkind, or being kind and being fake, neither of those possibilities really ring true for me when I think about all of the work that I've done in this space. Now, I realize that that's the work that I've done, and that's my reaction to psychedelics. But when I think about how these medicines have inspired me, how they've led to where I am today, I can't help but think that their message to me is that we need to be kinder and realer in equal quantities.
I agree. Yeah, you hit it. You hit the nail on the head there, Brett. Yeah, this has been really fun. It's always great to catch up with you, and I'm glad that the synchronicity lined up that we're recording this 4 years almost to our launch date. So it's fun that we came full circle, another 4 years. And yeah, thanks for being part of our journey, Brett. It's always fun to catch up and be part of it with you. And is there a website or anything that you want to direct people towards?
There will be, but not for right now. Maybe
okay, cool.
I'll send it to you when it's hatched.
All right, cool. We'll be sure to share it around then.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. Oh, and you know, I am looking for people that are interested in interning and volunteering,
cool,
as well as a few paid positions. So if you know anybody who's great, or if you yourself are interested, you can email me at brett@adeliacx.com. Awesome.
And how do you spell that? Is it you said Odelia?
It's ADELIACX.com.
Okay, awesome.
And by the way, Adelia means noble.
Noble
in Russian.
Cool. I like it. All right, Brett Greene, thanks for joining us on Psychedelics Today, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.